A tourist mocked Pope Francis for wearing old, worn-out shoes, but when the Pope turned around and spoke, what he said silenced the entire Vatican. So what exactly were his words that day? Before we reveal the full story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The morning sun cast long golden rays across St. Peter's Square, illuminating the massive colonnades that embraced visitors like outstretched arms. Thousands of tourists marveled at the grandeur, their necks craned upward at the imposing dome that seemed to touch the heavens itself. Among them stood Michael Bennett, checking his Rolex with thinly veiled impatience. Unlike the other visitors who had planned pilgrimages for months or years, Michael was here purely for business. As managing director of a luxury hotel chain, he had joined a delegation of British business leaders on a special access tour, part of negotiations for a potential conference center near Vatican City. The expensive Italian leather of his shoes gleamed in the morning light, matching his tailored charcoal suit and silk tie. "We'll be starting our exclusive tour momentarily," announced a Vatican representative, ushering the small group of 15. Business leaders passed the long lines of regular tourists. Michael nodded curtly to his colleagues, straightening his cufflinks as they were escorted through a side entrance reserved for diplomatic visitors. Inside, the cool air felt like a sanctuary from the Roman heat. Their footsteps echoed on marble, floors that had been tread upon by popes, kings, and emperors for centuries. Michael glanced at the gilt ceilings and Renaissance artwork with the calculated appraisal of someone who valued things primarily by their price tag. "Welcome to the Vatican," said a gentle voice. A nun in a simple grey habit approached the group with a warm smile. "I am Sister Maria, and I'll be your guide today. We are blessed that you've come during a time when His Holiness Pope Francis is in residence." Sister Maria's eyes sparkled with genuine affection as she mentioned the Pope. "You may have heard that Pope Francis prefers simpler accommodations than his predecessors. He chose not to live in the papal apartments, but instead resides in the Santa Marta guest house, where he eats with ordinary priests and visitors." An American woman in the group clasped her hands. "I've heard he even carries his own briefcase." "Is that true, sister?" "Yes," Sister Maria nodded. "Many things that were once done for the Pope, he insists on doing himself. He believes in humility as a practice, not just a concept." As they moved deeper into the Vatican, Michael observed other tourists pressing religious medallions to their hearts, some with tears in their eyes. An elderly couple knelt briefly in prayer when they passed a particularly beautiful chapel. All this devotion made Michael uncomfortable. In his world, emotions were kept strictly in check, especially in professional settings. "Today's tour will take us through some areas rarely seen by the public," Sister Maria continued, her voice echoing softly in the marble corridor. "And if we are truly blessed, we might catch a glimpse of His Holiness himself." Michael suppressed a sigh as Sister Maria led them through an ornate gallery lined with tapestries worth millions. This Vatican tour was nothing but a box to check, an obligation to please potential Italian investors who valued the Church's blessing on their ventures. He'd rather be finalizing contracts or checking on his London office. "The contrast is quite remarkable, isn't it?" whispered James Collins, another British executive walking beside Michael. "All this opulence, while they present Francis as the Pope of the poor." He gestured discreetly toward a gold-embellished altar visible through an archway. Michael nodded, grateful someone shared his perspective. "Quite the PR strategy," he murmured back. "Dress the man in simple clothes while he sits on a golden throne." A silver-haired woman in front of them turned slightly, her expression disapproving. Michael recognized her as Margaret Winters, CEO of a prominent charity foundation. She had been hanging on Sister Maria's every word about the Pope's humble origins in Argentina and his work with the poor. "If you gentlemen would prefer a financial audit to a spiritual journey, perhaps you should have stayed at the hotel," Margaret said quietly, but with unmistakable sharpness. Michael straightened his tie, embarrassed at being overheard, but unwilling to concede the point. "I'm simply noting the disconnect," he replied coolly. Sister Maria, who had paused to explain a particularly significant artwork, glanced their way. Her eyes met Michael's briefly, not with judgment, but with something that made him even more uncomfortable, understanding. "Many struggle with the Vatican's wealth," she said gently, somehow addressing the unspoken tension without singling anyone out. Pope Francis himself has spoken about this challenge. He believes the Church's treasures belong to humanity and history, not to him personally, which is why he chooses simplicity in all things he can control. The group continued through magnificent corridors, where bishops and cardinals occasionally passed, their red and purple vestments swishing importantly. Most nodded respectfully to Sister Maria. Michael noticed how some of the younger clergy seemed to walk with less pomp, their shoes more practical, their manner more approachable. The Francis effect, he supposed. "We are now approaching an area that is usually closed to visitors," Sister Maria announced as they turned down a narrower corridor. "It's being renovated to improve accessibility, a project Pope Francis personally requested to help elderly and disabled pilgrims." The polished marble gave way to temporary wooden flooring. Construction equipment lined one wall, and the sound of work could be heard ahead. The setting had shifted from museum-like grandeur to something more mundane. "Apologies for the disruption," Sister Maria said. "But I thought you might appreciate seeing how the Vatican is evolving under Pope Francis's guidance. He believes a church that doesn't change is a church that will die." Michael checked his watch again. How much longer would this tour last? He caught James rolling his eyes slightly and felt validated in his impatience. They were business leaders, not religious pilgrims. What was the point of showing them construction zones? The corridor opened into a wider space where scaffolding stretched toward a vaulted ceiling. Several workers in blue coveralls were carefully removing old plaster, while others measured and consulted blueprints spread across a makeshift table. Dust motes danced in beams of light from tall windows. The sound of gentle laughter drew the group's attention to a small cluster of workers gathered near a partially demolished wall. Among them stood a man in simple white clothes. Not the elaborate papal vestments Michael had expected from photos, but a plain white cassock with no ornamentation. He was nodding as a worker in a hard hat explained something, pointing to the exposed stonework. The man's posture was attentive, his expression genuinely interested. Sister Maria stopped abruptly, her hand rising to her heart. "Oh," she whispered, "what a blessing! It's His Holiness." A ripple of excitement passed through the tour group. Margaret gasped softly. An Italian businessman crossed himself. Even James straightened his posture. But Michael's eyes were drawn downward to the man's feet. Pope Francis wore simple black shoes, not the traditional red papal shoes of his predecessors, not even well-polished dress shoes one might expect from a world leader. These were practical, worn, and currently gathering dust from the construction site. They looked like shoes a parish priest might wear, not the head of the Catholic Church. "He wears ordinary shoes," Michael whispered to James, loud enough that several others could hear. "Surely the Vatican budget extends to proper footwear." One of the workers noticed the tour group and spoke quietly to the Pope. Pope Francis turned, his face breaking into a warm smile that transformed his serious features. He raised a hand in greeting and began walking toward them. "He's coming over," whispered a Japanese businessman, his voice tight with awe. Michael observed the Pope's approach with critical eyes. Up close, Francis looked his age, late 70s, with the slight stoop of a man who had carried burdens for many years. His cassock was clean but simple, with none of the golden embroidery Michael had seen in papal portraits throughout the Vatican. And those shoes, plain black leather, visibly worn at the heels and scuffed at the toes. "Welcome, friends," Pope Francis said in accented but clear English. "I hope Sister Maria is showing you the beauty of this place." His voice was warm, his gaze direct as it moved from person to person. Sister Maria bowed slightly. "Your Holiness, these are business leaders from several countries exploring partnership opportunities with Italian enterprises." "Ah, then you understand value and investment," the Pope said with a gentle smile. "I hope you also see the value in what cannot be bought or sold." Michael felt a strange discomfort as the Pope's eyes briefly met his. It wasn't judgment he saw there, but something more disarming, simple human connection, offered without condition. "We're upgrading this corridor," Francis explained, gesturing to the construction. "For too long, some parts of our church have been accessible only to the few. I want to change that." A worker called to the Pope in Italian, holding up a blueprint question. "Excuse me," Francis said to the group. "Duty calls, even in dusty corridors." As he turned back toward the workers, Michael couldn't help but stare again at those shoes, now leaving faint dusty footprints on the temporary flooring. The most powerful religious figure in the world, and he can't afford proper shoes. "Michael," remarked to James, his voice carrying farther in the sudden quiet of the corridor than he had intended. The words seemed to hang in the air like the dust particles caught in the sunlight. One by one, heads turned toward Michael. A worker holding measuring tape froze mid-motion. Sister Maria's gentle expression faltered. Margaret Winters inhaled sharply. James took a small step away from Michael, creating physical distance between himself and the comment. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull all oxygen from the space. 20 feet away, Pope Francis paused in his conversation with the worker. His shoulders stiffened slightly, the only indication he had heard. Slowly, deliberately, he turned back toward the group. His eyes, dark and penetrating, settled directly on Michael. Michael felt heat rise from his collar to his face. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist suddenly felt unnecessarily heavy. The polished leather of his own shoes seemed to gleam accusingly in the dusty environment. He hadn't meant, well, he had meant it, but he hadn't intended for the Pope himself. "To hear," Pope Francis handed the blueprint back to the worker and said something quietly in Italian. The man nodded, glancing curiously at the group. Other workers lowered their tools, sensing something significant was unfolding. "Your Holiness, I apologize for the interruption," Sister Maria said quickly, her voice tight with embarrassment. "We should continue our tour and let you return to your work." But Pope Francis raised his hand slightly, a gentle gesture that somehow commanded complete attention. "No need, sister. I think perhaps this is a moment for conversation, not movement." He began walking toward Michael, his well-worn shoes making soft sounds against the temporary flooring. Each step was unhurried, deliberate. The distance between them, perhaps 30 feet, felt to Michael like a long corridor of judgment. With each step the Pope took, Michael became more aware of every luxury item on his person. The hand-tailored suit, the silk tie, the gold cufflinks, the expensive watch. Margaret Winters stared at Michael with undisguised disapproval. The Japanese businessman looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation brewing. James had managed to slide behind another delegate, making himself nearly invisible. Pope Francis stopped just a few feet from Michael. This close, Michael could see the lines of age and experience etched into the Pope's face, the slight roughness of his hands. Not the soft hands of someone who avoided labor, but hands that had known work. "These shoes have caused quite a conversation," Pope Francis said, his voice neither angry nor defensive, but reflective. "They are not beautiful. I know this." Michael opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, to defend himself, but no words came. What could he possibly say now? The Pope's eyes met his again, and Michael was struck by their clarity. There was no anger there, no offense taken. Instead, he saw something far more disarming. Genuine interest, as if Michael's comment had opened a door rather than created a wall. "Would you like to know about these shoes?" Pope Francis asked Michael directly, his voice quiet enough that others had to lean in slightly to hear. Michael managed a stiff nod, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Holiness." Pope Francis smiled. Not the practiced smile of a public figure, but the warm expression of someone who saw an opportunity for connection rather than conflict. He gestured toward a nearby bench that had been placed against the wall for the workers. "Let's sit for a moment," he said, moving toward it with unhurried steps. The tour group parted like the Red Sea, creating a path. Michael hesitated, then followed, acutely aware of every eye upon him. They sat side by side, the Pope of the Catholic Church and the luxury hotel executive, an unlikely pairing on a simple wooden bench in a dusty corridor. The contrast between them was stark. Francis in his plain white cassock, Michael in his $3,000 suit. Pope Francis looked down at his shoes thoughtfully, then back at Michael. His voice was gentle, but carried clearly in the hushed corridor. "These shoes were given to me by a family in Buenos Aires just before I left for Rome," he began. "The Vasquez family, mother, father, and 3 children, living in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city." He touched the worn leather with a kind of reverence. "José Vasquez works as a cobbler, not in a fancy shop, but from a small stand he sets up each day in the market. His wife Elena cleans houses. They have very little." The Pope's eyes grew distant with memory. "When they heard I was to become Pope, they came to see me. José brought these shoes, wrapped in newspaper. He was trembling when he handed them to me." Francis looked directly at Michael now. "He told me his family had saved for 3 months to buy the leather. They ate only 1 meal a day during this time, so they could afford to make these shoes for me." Michael felt something twist in his chest, not quite shame, not quite empathy, but a complicated mixture of emotions he couldn't easily name. "José said to me, 'Father, when you walk in Rome, when you meet presidents and kings, we want you to remember us, the poor who cannot walk those marble halls.'" The Pope ran his finger along a scuff on the side of the shoe. "He asked me to wear them until they fell apart, so I would always keep my feet on the ground, even as others tried to elevate me." Sister Maria wiped a tear from her cheek. One of the construction workers crossed himself. The entire corridor had fallen under a spell woven by the Pope's quiet words. "I have many shoes I could wear," Francis continued. "The Vatican has centuries of tradition about papal dress. There are artisans who would create masterpieces for my feet if I asked." He smiled slightly. "Some of my advisors wish I would ask." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Michael's. "But when I wear these shoes, I feel José's hands in every step. I remember Eleanor and their children who went hungry, so I could walk in their gift, and most importantly, I remember my purpose." Pope Francis gestured toward the magnificent Vatican surroundings, visible beyond the construction area. "It would be easy to believe that gold and marble define the church, that power and tradition are what matter. But when I feel these worn shoes against my feet, I remember the church exists for those who will never enter these halls, for those whose own shoes are worn not by choice, but by necessity." He straightened slightly, his voice taking on a gentle strength. "So you see, Mr. Bennett," Michael supplied, his voice barely audible. "Michael Bennett." "Mr. Bennett," Pope Francis continued, "these shoes may not match the splendor of the Vatican, but they match its purpose, or at least what I believe its purpose should be." The Pope looked down at his shoes again, this time lifting one foot, slightly as if examining it anew. "The Vasquez family saved for 3 months, as I mentioned, but there is more to their story. Their oldest son, Mateo, has a heart condition. The medicine he needs is expensive. Some months they must choose between his medicine and food for everyone." Michael felt his throat tighten. The calculated luxury, Of his own life, the first-class flights, the five-star hotels, the Michelin-starred restaurants suddenly seemed not just extravagant, but obscene. When I learned they had sacrificed for these shoes, Francis continued, I tried to refuse. Keep your money for Mateo's medicine, I told them, but Jose's pride would not allow it. This is not charity we ask for, he said. This is the honor of giving a gift to God's servant. The Pope's voice grew softer, more reflective. I understood then that to refuse would be to deny them something precious, dignity, the dignity of being givers, not just receivers. He looked up at the ornate ceiling visible beyond the construction scaffolding. The church has many treasures, art that inspires faith, architecture that lifts the spirit toward heaven. These things have value. But we must never value things above people. We must never become so enamored with gold that we forget those who struggle for bread. Pope Francis turned his gaze back to Michael. These shoes remind me daily that my role is not to be elevated above others, but to walk alongside them, especially those who suffer, those who are excluded, those who are judged by appearances. The words struck Michael like a physical blow. Wasn't that exactly what he had done? Judged this man by his shoes. In my first days as Pope, Francis continued, a cardinal presented me with the traditional red papal shoes. Beautiful craftsmanship embroidered with gold, a symbol of office dating back centuries. He smiled gently. I thanked him for preserving tradition. Then I put them in a glass case where they belong, as history, not as something for my feet. He gestured toward the workers who had respectfully paused their tasks, listening intently. When I visit places like this, when I meet with those who build and clean and repair, I wear Jose's shoes. It helps me remember that Jesus washed feet. He didn't demand that they be adorned for his benefit. Francis leaned slightly toward Michael, his voice kind but direct. Mr. Bennet, we all choose what we value by how we dress, where we go, how we spend our resources. There is no sin in quality or beauty. But perhaps the true measure of our choices is not how they appear to others, but what they mean to the heart. The Pope's eyes carried a wisdom that made Michael want to look away, yet somehow he couldn't. It wasn't judgment he saw there, but an invitation to see differently, to reconsider, to imagine another way of measuring worth. The world tells us that value comes from appearance, from price, from exclusivity, Francis said. But I have found that the most valuable things often come wrapped in newspaper, given by hands that tremble with the magnitude of their giving. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. These shoes may not impress presidents or business leaders or fashion critics, but they have walked me through days when I've blessed the sick, consoled the grieving, and embraced the abandoned. For this, they are more precious to me than any jeweled slippers could ever be. A profound silence filled the corridor when Pope Francis finished speaking. No one moved. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the sunbeams. The Pope's words had transformed the air itself, making it thick with reflection. Sister Maria wiped another tear from her cheek, not attempting to hide her emotion. Margaret Winters stood with her hand pressed against her heart, her earlier disapproval of Michael now softened into something more complex. The construction workers remained motionless, tools forgotten in their hands. Michael sat still, his eyes fixed on the Pope's worn shoes. He felt stripped bare, his carefully constructed facade of success and sophistication peeled away by this gentleman's story. The shame he expected to feel was there, yes, but something else had joined it, a curiosity, a questioning he hadn't experienced since childhood. What else had he been measuring by the wrong standards? Whose hands had made his own expensive shoes? Had anyone sacrificed to create the luxury he took for granted? Pope Francis seemed to sense Michael's internal turmoil. He placed a weathered hand briefly on Michael's shoulder, a touch so light it was barely perceptible. yet it carried a weight of compassion that nearly undid the businessman completely. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Bennet," the Pope said quietly. "Sometimes God uses unexpected moments to speak to us all." With that, Francis stood, nodding respectfully to the entire group before turning back toward the workers. The man who had been showing him blueprints approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain if he should resume their earlier conversation. "Now, Lorenzo," the Pope said warmly in Italian that Michael somehow understood, "show me again your idea for the wheelchair access." Just like that, he returned to work, the leader of a global religion, continuing his conversation with a construction worker as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if the profound moment that had just transpired was simply part of the day's journey, neither more nor less important than the blueprints they now examined together. Sister Maria gently touched Michael's arm, drawing him back to the present moment. "We should continue," she said softly. Her eyes held no judgment, only kindness. Michael rose from the bench, his legs feeling oddly unsteady. The rest of the tour group looked at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. James had emerged from his hiding place, his face uncharacteristically thoughtful. As they moved away, continuing down the corridor, Michael found himself walking differently. Each step felt deliberate, conscious. He found himself aware of his shoes, in a way he had never been before. Their pristine shine, their perfect stitching, their unmistakable luxury. "His Holiness often has that effect on people," Sister Maria said quietly as they walked. "He sees beyond the surface to what lies beneath. It can be uncomfortable, but it is always a gift." Michael nodded, unable to form words. His mind was still, in that moment, sitting on a simple bench beside a man whose well-worn shoes carried more meaning than all the expensive footwear in Michael's extensive collection. The tour continued through magnificent papal apartments, past priceless artwork, and breathtaking architecture, but Michael barely registered any of it. His thoughts remained with those scuffed black shoes and the family who had gone hungry to make them. Once, catching his reflection in a gilded mirror, Michael barely recognized himself. It wasn't his appearance that had changed, but something in his eyes, a certainty shaken, a perspective shifted. The man who had entered the Vatican that morning was not the same man now walking its hallowed halls. Late afternoon sun bathed St. Peter's Square in golden light as the tour group emerged from the Vatican. Tourists still filled the massive plaza, taking photos and gazing up at the basilica's imposing facade. After the intimate encounter inside, the crowds and noise felt jarring to Michael. Sister Maria led them to the edge of the colonnade, where their Vatican visit would officially conclude. "Thank you for visiting the Holy See," she said. "I hope you take with you not only memories of beauty and history, but perhaps also something for the spirit." As the group began to disperse, Michael lingered, watching the interplay of light and shadow across the ancient stones. Sister Maria noticed his hesitation and approached quietly. "Mr. Bennet," she said gently, "if you would like a moment in the basilica for reflection, it remains open for another hour." Michael shook his head. "I wouldn't know what to do in there," he admitted. "I'm not religious." Sister Maria smiled. "Neither were many who met Jesus. They were simply human, with all the questions and complications that entails." She glanced toward the spot where they had encountered the Pope. "His Holiness believes genuine encounters matter more than formal prayers." James appeared at Michael's side, checking his watch. "The investors want to meet for drinks at 7, he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Will you join us?" Michael looked at his colleague, impeccably dressed, efficiently scheduled, completely focused on the business purpose of their visit. It was like looking in a mirror from a few hours ago, but the reflection no longer aligned with what he felt. "Inside. I think I need some time," Michael replied. "Please give them my regrets." James raised an eyebrow but nodded, moving away to join the others heading toward waiting cars. Sister Maria touched Michael's arm lightly. "Transformation begins with questions, Mr. Bennet, not with answers." With a final gentle smile, she turned and walked back toward the Vatican entrance, her simple shoes making soft sounds against the ancient pavement. Left alone, Michael moved to a bench at the square's edge. From here, he could observe the ebb and flow of humanity passing through this sacred space. Wealthy tourists with expensive cameras, humble pilgrims clutching rosaries, priests in cassocks, nuns in habits, families with tired children. A few yards away, a family sat resting on the edge of a fountain. They wore the unmistakable look of budget travelers, practical clothes, worn backpacks, the careful conservation of resources that marked those counting every euro. The father was helping his young daughter change her shoes. The ones she removed were clearly worn at the toes, the sole beginning to separate. Michael found himself staring at those shoes, imagining the journey they had taken to reach Rome, the sacrifices the family had likely made for this pilgrimage. In his previous life, the life of just hours ago, he wouldn't have noticed them at all. Now he couldn't look away, wondering, who made those shoes? How many hours had the father worked to purchase them? What stories could they tell about the paths they had walked? As the golden light began to fade from the square, Michael stood. His hotel was just a few blocks away, but he chose to walk rather than call for a car. Each step in his expensive shoes felt different now, heavier with awareness, lighter with possibility. Behind him, the dome of St. Peter's caught the last rays of sunset, glowing like a beacon against the darkening sky. But it wasn't the grandeur that followed Michael as he walked away. It was the memory of worn black shoes, carrying a man who understood that true value has nothing to do with price. What would you do if someone in a position of power and influence chose simplicity over luxury? Does the story of Pope Francis's shoes change how you think about the items you value most in your life? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had an interaction that changed your perspective completely, just like Michael's encounter with Pope Francis? Share your experience with our community. If you found this story meaningful, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for daily stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss our new uploads. Share this video with someone who might appreciate a reminder about what truly matters in life. It's not the things we own, but the meaning behind them that counts. We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another special story that will warm your heart and nourish your soul.